A general question. If one of us expresses a point of view and you really want to challenge us on that point of view, then go ahead and direct it, specifically if you care to. Okay, I'm going to read the objectives out loud. We purposely have not rehearsed what we're going to say, and although we find ourselves kind of slipping into the conversation, time now and then, but we've purposely not rehearsed because we'd like what we say to each other to be spontaneous, and I think that's probably the only way we can really approach this. But I'll read these objectives, and there are 5 of them, and they were written, incidentally, in I don't think I told John this, they're really quite old as far as objectives go, and it might be one of the reasons why they could stand up to a little testing. We can maybe see as we explore that in our conversation. But here we go with objectives for public library service. One was to facilitate informal self-education of all people in the community. Another, to enrich and further develop the subjects on which individuals are undertaking formal education. Another, to meet the informational needs of all. To support the educational, civic, and cultural activities of groups and organizations. And the last one listed is to encourage wholesome recreation and constructive use of leisure time. Okay, that's the way they are written, and I really feel that Joe wants us to analyze those, and I think he wants the students, rather than just buying them, and I think, Kay, you said to me in conversation that, well, sometimes we get a little hung up on objectives, and we say, well, there they are, and we feel good after we've written them, and we kind of shelve them. And it's one of our reasons for selecting this as a discussion for a program. And I have a feeling that maybe the reaction, Brooke, that I think that maybe some of our students may have would be, gee, those objectives are all right, maybe all right for a big library, but do they really apply to a small library? So I'd kind of like to get into them, not necessarily to take them one by one, but let's deal with this thinking in terms of if those are really objectives, and let's just for the purpose of discussion, let me say to you, well, those are pretty broad, and they're the kinds of things that maybe only a big library could really achieve. And what would that be? What would be your reaction to that? Brooke, do you want to speak to that first?
Well, I think they're very broad for a big library. They just seem to me to be too abstract. It's the kind of thing it's like God and motherhood. There they are, as you said.
Like especially to meet the informational needs.
It doesn't get down to what I tend to think about in thinking of community library service on the local level, when you almost can start to think about the person who had to drop out of school and doesn't know how to go back to finish high school, and he can come into the library, and the library may be able to tell him even about where adult basic education course is taught, about the individual person that you help. And you can say, well, how could you put that in an objective? But if you're looking at your community, which they talk about in this pamphlet, if one of your big community problems is economic, then why can't you have an objective that maybe relates to raising economic levels? I don't know, John. Am I all off base?
I don't think you're off base at all, and I think that objectives ought to be different from one community to the other. And I think that probably many of these that are written that we see in great detail here probably are going to be met whether or not the person running the library or the people using the library realize they're meeting those objectives or not. And maybe an example would be people in a community who are reading for recreation, just like to read. I think that would facilitate them meeting some of these other objectives and maybe not even know they're meeting them. They would get a lot of their educational needs met because they may have an interest in an area, maybe an interest in an occupational area, for example. And I think that even though we might not have all of these listed on the wall in one of our small community libraries, that just by meeting the real needs of people in a community, you're probably going to cover a lot of the objectives we've got here. And I don't know if it's too important to have the objectives memorized or to go into great detail with objectives, as long as the library is attempting always to meet the needs of the people that live in that community.
Okay, you're both really saying to localize those objectives, and that if you were critical of these at all, maybe you're critical because they're just too broad. Something comes to my mind, I guess it came to my mind when I read these, and that is, there's a really strong emphasis on the educational role here. And as a community college librarian, you know, in a community where we have several different kinds of library services, what is your response? Thinking about, is this really the role of the public library to assume that much responsibility?
Well, I think, again, these are very general. The whole idea, I think these are ideals, and they aren't really objectives in the sense that these are something that you can say, well, this is what we're going to do this year or next year. These are real ideals
point.
and goals. And I think that sometimes, from my experience, the public library has had some books that I haven't had, especially in Alaska, where it's a cooperative effort. I think that the community college is much more geared to helping people who are taking courses, or more formal education courses as the second one. The informal, if they don't have the course, then they're not going to have the books at the community college.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a dual role, I think, even in the community college. The community college role is dual because it is also serving the community, but perhaps not with the same types of material as the public library.
I'd like to pursue that idea of the community college also serving, you know, the entire community. I have really been impressed in the short time that I'm in Alaska that some of the things that we were talking about on the outside, as I've learned to say, always had to do with breaking down barriers. And it was the typical thing, well, I'm sorry, this building is locked promptly at 4 p.m., or I'm sorry, you don't have a card indicating. And are you really suggesting that that all facilities are available to everyone? I mean, when you said the
Well,
community college serves, and John, maybe you'd like to talk about that too. There seems to be this spirit a little bit in Alaska.
I'd like to, but I think Kay had something to add to it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that no one in Alaska has everything. And so that you have to share no matter what. And therefore, when a person in the public comes and says, you have the books that I'm trying to use, whether he's a student or not, he is allowed to, you know, he doesn't belong to us, you know, in other words, he is not of the academic community, but he is of the community here, and therefore he can use the materials that we have. And we don't really, I think that we have a large enough library that we can do that, but we do stipulate that if another student needs them, we would like to call them and see if the materials could be brought back if they are needed in an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only happened maybe once in the time I've been here in 4 years.
Sheila, I'd like to add to what Kay's had to say if I could. I have a strong bias in favor of a concept that in the school business we call community schools. And this idea is that people in a community have needs no matter what their ages may be. And this means that you attempt to do all you can to allow people of any age to use the school facilities to help meet these needs. And Juneau, because of a budget problem last spring, kind of went out of the business momentarily, and I hope it's just a short time. We used to have a couple full-time community school directors whose whole job was to try to meet the needs of the community from the time of 4 o'clock until basically midnight in some of the buildings. And we're continuing to operate one of our school libraries as a community library at Floyd Dryden Junior High. And we have hours set aside for the public to come in, and certain books that are mainly, I think what Kay was getting into, mainly meant for non-school use, but they're not really that rigidly divided. But the library is used both as a school library and also as a community library. And I think this would be a good idea for many communities to look at, because oftentimes we've been guilty around the country in the past of duplicating efforts.
And then setting up barriers worse
and
than
then
that. Not
spending
only-
more money for two parallel operations when we could do a lot better job with a single one, I think.
Right. I think that, you know, you've started talking about, if we look at this from the small community librarian's point of view, Kay's already said, okay, well, let's look at the total number of resources, and John said, and let's make sure that all those resources are available to everyone. Brooke, there's another element here I think you're probably just itching to add, which has to do with the whole idea of sharing beyond your community. In terms of being able to increase, I'm thinking of interlibrary loan and networking and so forth. What kinds of implications does that sharing thing have for someone who's a very small library with very small budget and so forth?
Well, I suppose, first of all, it's kind of a selfish. You think of all the things that you're able to get through the University of Alaska, through the State Library Network system. But getting back to when you're looking at your local community, every community is unique, and you do probably. Some of them may still be in oral form, that, not even recorded yet, but there are resources there that not just the Alaska Historical Library in Juneau is dying to get, but that the whole state needs to share. So there's a two-way thing there, and no matter how small you are, your actual collection may be very small, but there are unique community resources. There are people living there, and as the local librarian, that's your job to tap and record, and that is a big part of the sharing.
Yeah, the sharing thing just seems so large. I remember a conversation that goes back a long way, and fortunately I didn't hear it in this state. But I remember someone who was providing a community library service in a very small rural area in the state of Washington. And I remember this person saying, well, we're really small. There are only 450 people in this community, and our people aren't as interested. And the implication, we almost stopped her from saying this, and the implication was that if you live in a community with a small population, that somehow your intellectual interests or your needs and your abilities are limited by the size of community that you're in. And I remember we had a real hard time getting over that particular barrier and being able to, to really work with one another. This idea of living in a small, where there are very few people, in no way does it limit the materials that those people might want.
I had a late, great librarian friend who used to express it this way: small communities do not make small minds. And he used that always when we were planning networks to illustrate that.
This idea of small and not being able to buy. I'm trying to identify with a librarian who has $250 a year to spend, I think, when I start talking about the sharing aspect, resources and so forth.
Yeah, I would say that the ideals, as I call them, rather than objectives, that are listed here, I think that what perhaps was behind these was that if there were only a public library in the town, then this would be the ideal for that public library. But where there are other groups, and of course there are going to be, but not necessarily that many in a very small town, who have some resources, that is the time when you begin sharing the resources. And so these ideals are what you're trying to find within the community, and trying to work with. These are pointing to what you would like to have and what the public library might want to take a lead in. For example, the fourth one, to support the educational, civic, and cultural activities of groups and organizations. This could mean just having a meeting room, or it could be in New Jersey somewhere where they've sponsored a dance group, that Afro dance group. They have library grants in which they give the certain cultural groups.
Right, I remember reading about that.
Certain grants of money or something to further what they're doing for the community, and they're usually small community groups, or they might just be neighborhood groups. And so this, I'm not saying this is the way to go. I'm just saying that this might lead to something like that, which might be meaningful for the community. I myself do not believe in having a zoo just because we don't have one in Juneau in the public library, but it does lead to other things. And so these ideals might make people start thinking about what they could do for the community.
I think that particular objective to support shows that these goals are somewhat outdated, because I think we've come, as you say, the library may not be the one to start the zoo. However, what we're really thinking about now in up-to-date library services is not support as much as interaction. It's not a kind of passive thing where you let a local agency know what you have. It's where you get together with them and see what the needs are. And these goals are static. They are 10 years old, I guess.
I think that was my basic criticism of the fact that they really seem to be what we do and then it ends. They really beg to be followed through with by services. They really do. And the idea of the support as opposed to, something just came to my mind that I think might be fun to play around with a little bit. The idea of the public library as an agent for change is something that is really not expressed in this at all. And
Sheila, could I add one thing there?
do, right.
I know that many of our smaller libraries, probably out of necessity, have to stress books, and that's about the only approach. But one thing, as I read these objectives that hit me, it seemed like it was aimed mainly at the library that had nothing but books. And I know in the school end of it, and I think in community libraries too, such things as records and tapes and all kinds of other ways of imparting information and material to people are becoming part of what our libraries are media centers.
You have hit upon something which we are all disciplining ourselves really to get used to. And I'm going to say I'm impressed by Alaska. I have never seen people more free to speak of material. And that encompasses the whole picture. And now it's videotape too, right?
Right.
So it's really very broad. It's a good point, because there really is no feeling there for active use of all kinds of materials. There really isn't. Okay, the idea of the library as an agent for change has really gotten some, maybe, I think there's some controversy about whether or not the library has a responsibility for affecting social change. And in a small community, in what ways might the library actually make an impact, other than just storing materials and giving services?
Maybe, if I could take off on it for a second, by something I think Brooke was alluding to, or Kay, or maybe both, and that's aggressively letting the community know what you have to offer, and not just waiting. I think that some people have the old-fashioned view that years ago, and I think it was true years ago, the librarians, one of our main jobs was to guard those books and make sure that they were kept in good condition.
We call that the custodian.
Yeah, right. And I think the whole move now, I hope, is in the opposite direction of getting materials used, not abused, but used well.
Right.
And no, this is what we certainly look for in hiring librarians within the Juneau District. We're looking for somebody who will make it a vibrant, live place for people to be.
I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the role as a change agent. I think that it is a matter for debate, but what I have seen happen in very small communities is that the library, in the absence of a museum and in the absence of, say, an adult basic education program, can often be a catalyst to begin something that, if in fact there is a real community need so that local support can be generated, then maybe the library then assumes a support role later. But I have seen this happen with adult basic education, in which the library took the lead in helping teach people who did not read to read. And then later on, other agencies moved in. But I think you have to be alert to that kind of opportunity. And I guess they are trying to imply that when they say support. Sheila, are we going to get to that last objective?
This has been kind of fun, because I think that, although we didn't say so to each other, that we were a little disturbed by the wording of the last objective, and I'm going to read it again, so give us a little platform from which to take off, because it says to encourage wholesome recreation and constructive use of leisure time. And I'm going to give everyone else a chance to respond to that before I really get into it. So, Kay, I know you had a feeling about it when you read it too.
Well, I thought it was sort of patronizing in a way, because it seems to be leaving it up to the librarian to decide what is wholesome and what is constructive use of leisure time. I think that the idea perhaps behind it is that the library is one of those upright institutions in the community, and perhaps can take the lead in making sure that no one gets into trouble, or by
Are you
doing
suggesting that the library ought not to be upright?
But this is my reaction was that I wouldn't want to go there if, that's all they, it's not an interesting place. You want to encourage recreational reading, and you want to encourage their reading or, using the other materials and leisure time. But how can you say what is wholesome for one person? And that's what really bothered me about the whole thing, is the fact that there is some choice made when you're choosing materials. There's no doubt about that. But and therefore you are using your own judgment and other people's judgments when you do choose materials for the library. But I can't say that I would read all the books that I bought from my library, but I knew that other people were interested in reading them.
Okay, great. Let's go just almost right down the line with your. Did you have that? I didn't.
Yeah,
Did I put
think-
words in your mouth,
no,
or did you have that reaction?
I generally had that feeling because it appeared to me that somebody was superimposing all kinds of values on other people, and it seems to me that something that might not look constructive to the librarian or somebody else might be a very constructive thing to the person that it's occurring to. And I don't think I put that very well, but an example maybe would be from my field of education. One thing I think we're learning is that when it comes to teaching reading, one thing we really need to encourage is a lot of reading. And at times it can mean somebody reading an awful lot of science fiction maybe, who somebody else might not feel the person ought to be doing. And I think that we need to leave more of these things up to the individual than we need to have somebody saying this is the only thing you ought to do and this is what's good for you.
Brooke, I know you deserve a chance to talk about that. This is going to be one of the most frustrating things because we're getting warmed up, and I am aware that we don't have that many more minutes in the program. Why don't you tell us why you were uncomfortable with it too? Or is it very similar?
In 25 words or less. Well, I'll just say that I think what it does is contribute to the prissy or custodial image that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And, that librarians really aren't, although we do when we select, but we're not in the business of making that kind of judgment. And that's, if we perpetuate this kind of thinking, the library is never going to be that comfortable a place. So we have to kind of guard against that and maybe lean a little bit back the other way. And that's why it bothers me. Certainly we're not against constructive use of leisure time, but we don't want to be moralizing and preaching either.
Yeah, I think, and I bet that was why we were as uncomfortable with it as we were. I've received a note from our crew telling us that who is listening today and so forth. I have a feeling that we have filled this program so fully that there maybe are recording questions that we'll never get to. And I should say to those of you who are watching us live that our plan for the workshop is more or less to take up and expand on these objectives so that if we have done something to you and you haven't had a chance to respond or ask a question of us today, there will be a forum for us to do that. And it's ironic. We were kind of nervously asking ourselves, will we be able to fill up this time? And we've come down, and as far as I'm concerned, maybe there's some things that we haven't even begun to scratch. And I have a feeling by asking you to limit your comments on on this last one, we could have easily have discussed that, really at length. But let me say thank you to Brooke and John and Kay, because we are practically out of time, and it will be fun to see what we have stimulated, essentially, in the field. And thanks very much, especially for doing it in this brief of a notice. And I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed having other people share this program too. Thanks very much to each one of you.
Thanks for
It's our
having me.
pleasure. Yeah.